End of the day, I still feel like such an imposter. I had no interest in going into tech at all. And at that point, I had no idea that I could make a career out of design or anything like that. The design you did for GDC was pretty good. Do you want to work on design full time? I don't think I've ever got over that imposter syndrome sort of thing. I highly recommend everyone who works in design and tech to, have a good therapist. To say it's difficult to break into design early career is an understatement. That's maybe not the most inspirational thing to say, but it's a journey and it's work.
You ever felt like an imposter at work, even after landing your dream role? Today's guest, Matt Armstrong, knows that feeling all too well, and he's here to tell you why it's not just normal, but also a sign of growth. Matt's career has taken him from high school web design projects to leading design systems at companies like Zendesk and Dropbox. Along the way, he's faced the pressure of high-stakes rebrands, the uncertainty of burnout, and the ongoing challenge of imposter syndrome, lessons that are invaluable for designers at any stage in their journey. I'm your host, Chris Abad, and this is Pixelated Path. If you've ever felt like you don't belong or wondered how to make it in a tough market, this episode's for you. But before we jump in, don't forget to subscribe to Pixelated Path so you never miss an episode packed with inspiring stories and practical advice. Let's jump in. Matt, you started your career at Dropbox actually in operations as a project manager. So
yeah, well,
tell me about that.
I don't know if that was technically my role, actually. My entire time at Dropbox, I don't actually know what my job title actually was. But that's kind of how things were when it was, early stage startup. I think, so I joined in 2012. I think at that era, a lot of people still thought of Dropbox as like very, pretty well known and all of that. I mean, in college, I definitely knew about it, and they had that whole ambassador program. So everyone was just like scrambling for free space. But when I joined, it was only like 90 people. And I remember I joined along with a bunch of the summer interns, and CJ, who became the CFO, I believe, he gave this whole talk about, oh yeah, when your parents ask why you're crazy for joining Dropbox in this like early stage startup, here are the things to tell them. And I was like, I never thought of any of that or of Dropbox being an early stage startup, but that's a long way of saying I had a lot of different hats while I was at Dropbox.
I mean, at 90 people, that I think by most definitions, especially if you look at like where the size that Dropbox got to, like 90 is very early. So tell me more about like how did you end up at Dropbox? Why did you join?
Okay, this is going to be another of my rambling stories, but it gets around somewhere. So Dropbox was really, really heavy into college recruiting at the time. I had actually back in the day, no interest in going into tech at all. Like I've always been into computers, but more in the sense of building them and playing video games. But they were doing a recruiting event. I used Dropbox. I was like, okay, it'll be cool to just go say hi. And also I was the one Windows Phone person on the planet. So I wanted to go be playfully mean to them about why they didn't have a Windows Phone app. So after the talk, I went up and started chatting with some of the folks there and did exactly my playbook of complaining about why there wasn't a Windows Phone app. And we just got to talking and everything. Then I went out to dinner with the team, and a week later I was up in San Francisco and had a job on, I think I initially started on support. Then I moved on to operations / BizOps, then / data science. And I worked on Android for a little bit. And yeah, I think that was kind of the interesting thing to maybe jump into the next question, which is, I'm assuming, it's kind of what are the advantages of doing this sort of early stage startup, even though, 90 isn't early stage by most definition anymore, but you just get a lot of flexibility to try a lot of different things. And I had no idea what I actually wanted to do, except I knew I didn't want to go and do my PhD. That was pretty much the motivating factor.
You're in school, you studied psychology?
Yes, psychology, and then I did Asian studies also because I was too lazy to get up and do my Spanish qualifying tests. So I was like, well, I guess we're going to study Korean now.
So what sold you then on Dropbox, either like at the dinner or like the folks that you met with? Because clearly when you first approached them, that wasn't your goal to get a job there.
Yeah, I'll be honest, one of the primary motivations, which was like, oh, I'm graduating in a month and I have no idea what I'm going to do. I probably need a job. So that was definitely like weighing pretty heavily on my mind. But I certainly followed tech. I followed what was going on in the industry and everything in San Francisco. And I was like, this seems like a pretty good opportunity to get in and figure out what I actually want to do, since I was a little bit lost at the moment. And at that point, I had no idea that I could make a career out of design or anything like that. That wasn't even something that popped in my brain at all. I was like, okay, maybe I can go into project management or, pretend like I could actually code well enough to be an engineer, but just wasn't really sure. So that was definitely part of it. But I think also, again, I had been following the industry for a while, and I love tech and I love computers. So it seemed like an area that I could get really passionate about and learn a lot of things in. So that was really the primary motivation at the time.
Tell me about your interest in computers. When did that start?
Oh, I mean, God, probably when I was like 4 or 5. I think we got our first computer when I was about 4, and it was, like a DOS 5, 286 or 386. And then we just kept getting more and more computers over the years. So for my age, I actually started with a lot of more, I would say, retro tech for the era. Because, people were using Windows at that point, and Windows was like an exciting big upgrade. I remember when we had to upgrade to 8 megabytes of RAM so we could play Putt Putt Goes to the Zoo. And yeah, it was just something that my family always just kind of had an interest in, and I just became pretty enamored by computers early on. And, I started, taking apart and rebuilding computers when I was maybe 6 or 7. I was one of those kids that went to computer camp every summer. And then, yeah, that actually led to in high school, starting a web design business. And, I still to this day build custom gaming PCs for people. And that actually was a fun little side hustle in high school and college.
Nice. So you're, obviously looking back at this point, like you've had a long and well-established career in design, but that started in high school with a web design company. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So it was a small web design company, me and one of my buddies. He could code way better than I could, but I was better at Flash and all that. For those of you that are younger than we are, Flash was a big deal back in the day. But yeah, we started this small little business doing websites we did our school website, actually. That was probably our biggest project. Then we did a bunch of like small business websites for teachers and parents at the school and all of that. And that turned out pretty well. And then, when we weren't working on that, we would take our computers, like we would lug our like desktop towers into school and just play Unreal Tournament in the computer lab, which was pretty fun. But yeah, besides that, I also was doing, this dates me a bit, I was doing like forum footers for people on the Tech TV forums and Hard OCP and stuff like that, which was fun. Using, the pirated copy of Photoshop that everyone had back in the day. Sorry, Adobe, I pay for you now.
Yeah, man, how many designers wouldn't even be in the profession that they're in if it weren't for pirated software in high school?
Yeah, I don't think people know how good we had it back in the day, where you could just pirate like CS2 and keep it forever. It was great. I think I rolled on that pirated copy of CS2 for about a decade.
So in high school, you decided to start a web design company. I think the nice thing about this like line of work today is you can actually go to school and get a degree in this stuff. Like there's structured, formal training and education where a good chunk of the information is consolidated. But that wasn't the case for you, I imagine.
Oh, yeah.
How did you learn?
That's a really good question, and what I'm going to probably have a bad answer to. But yeah, you're totally right. Like, I didn't know that design was a thing I could even do or pursue, let alone like figure out a path how to get into that. So a lot of my journey up until like landing my first design gig was stumbling around in the dark. And to your point, also, I think it's really good that there is more of this formalized path to getting into, I guess, like corporate design as we think of it right now. There's always been, graphic design programs, stuff like that, art schools, all of that sort of thing. But I think at least back in the day, at least, when I was in high school, college, it wasn't talked about. Design wasn't really talked about in the same way it is right now. So I guess that's a roundabout way of saying the path wasn't super clear. And as far as learning things, that's just the story of, I think, everyone's career and everyone's journey in whatever profession you're in. Sure, if you have a more formalized education path, like you definitely start out with more of the raw knowledge and all that. But at the end of the day, the more senior I get in my career, the more I realize I know absolutely nothing and there's so much more I can learn. And I think regardless of where you start, you're going to hit that point, whether it's, 4 or 5 years into your career, maybe earlier, maybe later, whatever, you're going to hit this point where you're just like, wow, there's so much out there that I don't know. And then that kind of loops back into it. The whole journey after that is kind of a lifelong of discovery and learning. And like, it's great that there's so many resources online now. That's a huge, amazing thing for being able to, teach yourself, learn all of that, and just getting exposure to a lot of different art and different mediums and all that. Like you can take inspiration from so much and learn from so much. And to some extent, I actually think there's value in going into something a little bit blind so you don't wrap your head around preconceived notions about what is right or good or any of that. And it helps you kind of develop your taste a bit. So that's a very roundabout way of kind of describing my learning journey with things. But, it was, you have to put in a lot of work to kind of catch up if you're not coming from, formalized background, I would say, but it's definitely possible. And I think a lot of the best designers I know didn't, go to art school or anything like that. Not saying I'm lumping myself in that category because I'm a particularly good designer. I just fumbled around until things worked.
Yeah, I don't know. I would say, given some of the roles that you've held at some really amazing companies, I imagine they would say otherwise. But I want to
thank you. Flattery will get you everywhere.
I want to talk about some of those other roles a bit later. In the beginning, so, you didn't have a formal training in design. Yeah. There weren't a lot of like coordinated, consolidated resources to go learn this stuff. Did you was there like maybe a book or someplace online or a particular person that you just like really help push you forward or like kind of help learn the ropes?
Yeah. So, I mean, so you can probably tell from, just like my background doing web design and, crap like that. I was very interested in design and aesthetics and all of that, all of my life. But I think like a lot of my inspiration, it didn't come from like product design or, what I'm doing right now. Is very much more like looking at music, brand design, creative direction for, ads, movies, video games have been a huge inspiration for me too. No surprise. But there was one that really, really stood out I think this was either end of high school, beginning of college, but I'm sure you're familiar with 9 Inch Nails, but they have had an absolutely amazing art director, Rob Sheridan, who you may know and be familiar with. Absolutely brilliant designer. And the album Year Zero had this amazing ARG with all of Rob's glitch art and all of that. And that just absolutely floored me when I saw it. I got really into the ARG. I like made prints of a lot of the glitch art and all that. And that was like by root in high school and college. And that was one of those things that just really blew me away. And Rob's work over the years has just been absolutely inspirational for me. I think that's something that's really important to think about if you're doing design. And I mean, whether you consider design art, like product design art or not, that's a whole bigger debate that I'm probably not smart enough to touch on. But I really think it's important to take inspiration from other things that are creative outlets. And at the end of the day, just about anything can be a creative outlet, whether it's cooking or painting, making music, writing code. Any of that can be a creative outlet that you can learn from. Like I've learned a ton from attempting to learn how to cook and watching cooking shows and stuff like that. Same with looking at album art or just watching movies. And there are just subtle things, whether it's learning more about color, composition, all of that, that you just kind of can start to absorb, or even things around process. And I think like, learning about how professional kitchens work is something that I found really interesting and inspirational, definitely at like the high end of, places that like Dominique Crenn does or in Gordon Ramsay. I'm a huge fan of, by the way. I love Gordon Ramsay.
It's interesting.
But yeah, I think you can just take so much inspiration and learn so much just by immersing yourself in things other people have created. And it doesn't have to be related to the exact same medium that you're trying to work in.
Can you give me an example of how like something that you've learned from how kitchens run has made its way into your UX design work?
Yeah, I think it probably touches a little bit more on, I'd say 2 things. Definitely there's some things I've learned around management from how kitchens are run, particularly around maybe critiques and all that. But that touches into, I think, maybe the broader point where if you're, looking at like a 3-star Michelin or 3 Michelin star restaurant, there's a certain attention to craft and care that is almost obsessive. And I think that it's also something where it's not about you as the person creating a dish or something like that. It's about working together as a whole to create something more than the sum of its parts or more than what any individual could actually do. And I think that's something that's really important to remember if you're going into critique, receiving feedback, or, running a critique, in that it's all about elevation of the work and bringing everyone up, whether it's the designer working on it, the team, and obviously the end user. So that's something that I really took inspiration from as I learned more about like high-end cooking. Just like the attention to detail and care about the holistic experience across the board is something that I think is really important. And I think there's a principle that comes out of it, and Amazon is really well known for promoting this, but disagree and commit is something that's like so fundamental to moving forward as a group. Since let's be real, we all know consensus decision making. I can't speak. That is a tongue twister. Wow. You end up making, in Parks and Terms parlance, a camel, which is a horse designed by a committee. And at the end of the day, you do kind of need to just like make a decision and move forward, even if not everyone agrees with it. And this is something that I learned really, really well at Square, a company which really, really embodies a lot of that, like, disagree, commit Amazon attitude. And I think that's an interesting thing, particularly if you're in management or art direction or whatever, to keep in mind going into crit, in terms of like if you have to make that decision, how to make it without feeling like it's, oh, Matt just saying we have to do this, and actually bringing people along, even if you, end of the day, are the one making a decision. And that's, I don't know, it's interesting line to walk. And you see that so much in cooking that, I don't know, it's interesting to learn from.
Something you said earlier was interesting with the way that you have learned to run crits and the different ways that you can uplift, whether it's the individual designer, the customer. Let's say you and I are working together, we're in a crit together. What are some of the things, like if you're running the crit, what are some things that I might see that are maybe atypical compared to like other crits that you've seen? Like what's different about your approach?
Excuse me. I think what's different about my approach, that's a really good question. I would say, particularly when I'm working on design systems, I often will be working so horizontally, I don't have a lot of context on individual projects that are going on, or, I don't have domain expertise in a certain area. Like I was at Ripple right before this, and to this day, I couldn't tell you a single thing about crypto, for example. But to some extent, that's actually a strength when you go into a crit, because it opens you up to be providing essentially feedback or perspective of maybe like a first-time user, someone who's never seen this before and doesn't understand how this works. So you almost get to, play devil's advocate, or more just like, bring some naivety to bringing feedback. And that comes in the form of asking a lot of questions, or if there's something that seems obvious that you could do, like pattern-wise or component-wise or style-wise, what have you, you can just ask with the assumption that they probably already tried a billion different things, because that's how the process goes. You can just kind of ask like, oh, did you think of this, and like maybe why or why not it wouldn't work? And I think framing things, a lot of the perspective from coming in, just asking questions, helps kind of soften people up to feedback, and then also have a more just open and honest dialogue, because it's not someone just coming in and being like steamrolling work without context or anything like that. But you can still give that sort of more critical feedback through this process of asking questions and really just making it more conversational. And, there's a framework I really like called authentic leadership, which is, I like it because it's simple. It's just bring your authentic self to conversations, to work, and all of that. And I think approaching crits from that perspective, particularly when you are the one making decisions, just makes it feel a little bit more friendly and participatory, which ultimately should be the goal. But, especially if you're working so horizontally and all that, you're not always going to have the time to make those, one-on-one relationships. So you kind of have to read the audience and do it in real time. And I find that just asking questions works really well. And I'm sure a lot of other people doing crits already ask questions and all that, but I think it's the intent of how you ask the questions and just the tone and all that really, I don't know, it makes it a little bit different.
To go further into that a little bit, I mean, a lot of the roles that you've held, you are setting like a new direction for the design and the visual aesthetic. And so whether that's officially part of your role or not, like this role of art director, or even, like going back to your cooking analogy, like the executive chef with the vision in your head. And like, you can only pull so much out, or like get close enough to what you're looking for through question asking. So
Yeah.
how do you balance that? How do you know the difference between asking questions and where you just sort of have to say, like, we need to go this way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So typically I would say when at least my experience working on rebrands and doing more of this art director role, which is really what it seems like my role evolves into every company I've been at, usually that gets segmented down to a smaller group of people that you do have a closer working relationship with rather than like, at Meta when you're potentially working with like 80 different designers and all that. So that makes it the approach a little bit different because you do have those opportunities and time and that longer time scale of working together to build out those relationships. So I think end of the day, it's the same principles, but you're right. Asking questions only gets you so far. But the intent of asking the questions is building trust and rapport to actually have quick, open, and honest dialogue. So there's still fundamentally that part of it at the beginning of these longer time scale, smaller, more intimate group projects. And, you start like approaching crit the exact same way of maybe a point of naivety, asking questions can be really helpful. And then like just actually spending time doing what I like to call jam sessions, I think are really, really valuable of just sitting down for an hour with someone and being like, hey, let's work through XYZ problem that came up in crit and, just play around with a couple of different ideas and actually, sitting next to each other or like on a Zoom together, working in Figma together and actually getting in the weeds with the work is something that I found is really powerful for actually building that rapport and trust and making it feel very collaborative, which I think end of the day absolutely is how things should be approached in an art director role. But you're right, it's a very fine tightrope to walk because if you don't kind of have a line where you cut off and just are like, okay, we need to ship this, we need to do something, we need to make a decision. If you don't have that and you don't have the trust built to be able to say that, then things get really, really messy. You need to spend a lot of time kind of navigating more interpersonal challenges and all that, at least from my experience. But I think setting expectations early and often, just around like, hey, at a certain point, I am going to have to make a decision about XYZ, but everyone needs to be heard around this. And we need to like, at least make sure all the information is out in the open and then we'll move forward with what seems like the best, most reasonable direction. And I think that goes back to defining leadership, just being clear about what the actual process and expectations are as you're going along is really important. So nobody feels blindsided or like they didn't have a chance to talk or contribute, which I found is the biggest thing that comes up in projects like this, people not feeling like they were heard. So pretty much anything you can try to mitigate that is really, really important. But again, end of the day, like it's all the same theme of what you should be shooting for, whether it's like a more horizontal critique, or if it's a project that you're working on really closely with a group of people. But, it's kind of like improv to some extent. Every group is going to be different. Every set of people is going to be different. Every project is going to be different. So I think just learning how to be adaptable to that and bringing a lot of empathy to the table is really important because there's not in my mind, there's not a perfect playbook that you can follow for this. This isn't something where you pull up your paper doc and, you go through the steps and, it's all fine. It's not, the IDEO design thinking approach. It's adapting to people and people are fundamentally a little bit messy and complicated and you just have to roll with the punches. And I think honestly, that's probably the skill that I've developed the most through my career. I'm still like learning a ton with that, but learning how to do that, I think has been one of the things that has helped me a lot in my career. Just learning how to adapt and roll with what needs to be done and what's going on with people, the company, all of that, and just taking it in stride. So yeah, I think learning how to adapt is super important for being able to build that trust and build those relationships to actually make decisions and sell ultimately. Design is so much sales. It's borderline not funny.
Even though you went on to have a career not only in tech, but specifically in design, do you feel like any of your education in psychology, like translated into what you do now, especially with some of the things you're talking about with people management?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So I think everyone who's a psych major that got into design or product management has been asked this question at some point. And, there's not a lot that I learned with my psych degree that is directly relevant to what I've been doing in design, which is ironic considering I focus mainly on memory and decision making, which you think would be like really, really applicable. And there's like one or two things around like need for cognition and stuff like that that are helpful for basically thinking about how to build empathy with users and all of that, but it's not something I use a ton. I think more like going through leadership courses, public speaking courses, and then being decent at statistics and math, which is a big part of my psych degree. Those are the things that I think have been the most useful in my career by far, rather than just like abnormal psych classes or something like that. Although abnormal psych classes are great if you want to annoy your therapist, I highly recommend it. They love it.
So the things that you talked about that you feel like did help you in your current career, you had me up until math and statistics. Tell me more about that. Like where does that show up for you?
Yeah, I mean, stats is super helpful, particularly if you're, working with user research or if you have to do user research and, analysis yourself. I also have a little bit of a data science background, so I've done that and, I code a bit also. And math is just always super helpful to learn. Like it's the amount of just basic math that I do in my head just around like for putting together layouts and stuff like that. I use math way more than I actually expect. And it's super useful just in terms of speed to be able to do a lot of things very quickly in your head. So learning mental math is great. But I mean, also if you want to just understand like AI and algorithms and stuff like that better, having a basic understanding of, higher level math is helpful, at least, even if you're not writing code. Like, it's funny, a little while ago, I supposed to do a talk just on like something that you're really interested in and something we were doing as a team, and everyone else was doing things like around just like hobbies that they had. And I hadn't seen a lot of these. And I went in and gave like a master's level stats course talking about AI. And I got some feedback afterwards. It was like, nobody understood anything you're talking about. And I was like, cool, I should have talked about video games or something or movies. But that's, I guess, a roundabout way of saying like math is really, really important if you want to just understand what you're building, what you're working on, and just what's kind of going on in tech. I find it immensely useful for just better understanding the world.
I want to go
I
back.
love math.
I want to go back to your time at Dropbox because I mean, whether it was that you saw something that a lot of other people didn't, or whether it was just sheer luck, like you ended up at really the ground floor of, what became an incredible company. What was it like during that time? Like were they in a sort of rapid growth phase or were they in sort of
Oh
a
yeah.
wandering in the wilderness phase?
Yeah. So great question. So I've been at Dropbox twice. I boomeranged. But when I was first there, I was there for like 2.5 years, I think. And we went from about 90 people when I started to, I want to say around 2,000 when I left.
Wow.
So there was an immense amount of growth very quickly. It went from like within a year and a half, it went from you knew everyone in the office on a first name basis and you've had like, deep conversations with everyone to then not knowing anyone's names outside of that initial group and it just being overwhelming. I think it's a very cool experience to have been able to go through a hypergrowth phase because it's increasingly less common. And I think a lot of the staff growth perspectives and all of that have changed in tech quite a bit. So it was interesting to be able to experience that, particularly at kind of the wild days of VC money in San Francisco tech. So yeah, I definitely have stories. I don't know how many I can share on this podcast, but no, nothing that bad. But yeah, it was just like a lot of young folks and a lot of, it was a fun time. Like we were all really close. We would hang out, throw parties a lot. And flip side is also work extremely hard and put in a lot of hours. But I'm glad I did it at the age I did and like right out of college when I was already used to like grinding a lot and having a very weird sleep schedule. So I'm glad I did it at that age because I don't think I would have the patience or the energy to do that sort of intensity again. But it was definitely an interesting learning experience. I'm not sure what I learned from it, but I feel like I learned a lot. But definitely like the biggest thing that I got from my time at Dropbox is just the people that I got to meet. I was there when like all of the like celebrity designers were going through. So I got a very interesting opportunity to, get to meet all of these people. And I mean, I wouldn't be in design without like Morgan Knudsen and Devin Co, encouraging me and, helping me. And like basically everyone from that era has been super helpful for me in my career in some way or another. And also just like amazing friends that I've made. So yeah, that was a really just rare and unique opportunity that I look back on and I'm like kind of stunned that I got to meet all these people. Yep. Learned that design is actually a career I could do.
Did you start doing design work during your first time at Dropbox or not until you came back?
Not until I came back. So this probably leads into the story of like how I actually got into design. So I got moved onto Mailbox, and I again have no idea what my job title was,
Poor
but mostly
Mailbox.
I know, I like, it was such a cool experience to be able to be on that team, but yeah, it was such a bummer that it ended the way it did. Yeah, I have stories that, oh, poor Mailbox. But yeah, I was doing more data science stuff at that point, and I just didn't really want to do that. And I was kind of ready to just move on and find something different, because at that time it just wasn't super clear what I wanted to do at Dropbox also, because I just knew I didn't want to keep staying up until like 5 a.m. working on like Hive. So I moved over to Zendesk because I was really close with the Zendesk team I don't even remember how I got to meet all of them. I think it was through karaoke, to be totally honest. So I went over to Zendesk and I joined the marketing team there. And that's actually when I started doing design, because the brand team at Zendesk didn't have bandwidth to work with me on any of the stuff that I was doing, because I was like flying around giving JavaScript talks. And I think the big thing that I was working on was the gaming vertical. So I was in charge of marketing and like partner management for a lot of that. So I was working with like Riot Games and King a lot. And then I got the idea of like, oh, G's here, let's do a whole GDC thing. So I did all the booth design, posters, flyers. I did a website for us to do, which I don't even remember if that launched or if we just designed it. But end of the day, one of our design program managers reached out to me and she's like, hey, the design you did for GDC was pretty good. Do you want to come work on design full time? And I was like, that seems really cool and more fun than working on marketing right now. So I said yes, and then I met with the VP of design, Ryan Donahue, really good friend of mine now, and I guess he learned that I could code badly, and he was like, hey, so we want to do a design system here at Zendesk. You can code, right? Cool. You're going to be the designer on design systems. And that was pretty much how my career started. Design systems was me and one engineer while we built Garden, and I mean, my whole career kind of took off from me just getting bored over Christmas one year and redesigning all of this. So that was kind of how things went. Yeah.
I mean,
Rambling answer, but yeah.
during the
I
time
was just lucky.
during the time that Ryan was there, I mean, the rebrand that
Yeah.
Zendesk went through was really amazing work. Were you there through that? Were you working on like
Oh,
the
yeah.
design system and?
Yeah, I was the lead, I guess like the creative lead for product on that. So I was in charge of everything product related. Erin Pinkley, my partner in crime, she was creative directing everything on the brand side, and we just worked really, really close together. Yeah, so Erin Pinkley and I were kind of the co-leads on that. And then obviously everyone else on the team is super involved. I think Bob Galmarini was like the creative lead over all of it at the time. Don't quote me on this. I'm probably going to get some of this wrong, so folks, I apologize, but I think Bob Galmarini was like the creative lead for all of that also. So yeah, it was a wild time. Like we were just kind of like locked in a room, just jamming away on stuff for a couple of months. And I'm glad the rebrand was as well received as it was. We went through so many different iterations on that. It's not even funny, but there was one I really liked that was a little bit more, it felt like something Lyft would do, and I really, really liked it at the time, but that got scrapped immediately. But yeah, it was a really interesting rebrand process, and I'm glad it was well received, because we shipped like a month or two after the Instagram rebrand, which everyone hated. And we talked to the team over at Instagram, and we asked them, I think Ryan asked them one question of, what's the best piece of advice you could give us as we're going through a rebrand? And I forget who it was, but they just said, don't do it. And I was like really worried at the time. I was like, oh, this is like my first really big project that I've worked on, and am I going to just get dragged on Twitter for this? And this was in the era where design Twitter was really fucking mean on Twitter also. So I was like cold sweats when we launched that, but hey, it turned out fine. And like, it's kind of amazing that it's held up to this day. I check it every once in a while to see like, when they do the next rebrand, but it seems like what we did has been pretty extensible. I know Adam Ho did a ton of work on it also with like the Sunshine product, and that really like elevated the brand system a lot. And I mean, no surprise, because Adam Ho is amazing, but I'm gonna name drop too many people.
I think
Don't worry, I'm not cruel.
I think the system that you had with the shapes and how that
Yeah.
tied into both the Zendesk logo and then the different, because that, like, you're sort of getting to like a suite of products. And I think the
Yeah.
brand like reinforced that well because of the different shapes and how you work that into sort of the mark for each product. And like you said,
Yeah.
I think that made it very extensible and flexible, which is why it's had some good staying power.
Yeah, that was definitely the goal with it. And similarly with the product side of things and the data design system, we wanted it to be something that we knew we were going to keep iterating on it and tweaking it till the end of time, but we wanted a really, really good both technical and design foundation in order to do that. And I think we landed on a pretty good place. And I mean, I look at, the work that's been done on it since I left, and I'm like, yeah, all of this makes perfect sense. And it's also still feeling pretty modern for nowadays even. So it's kind of amazing, like when you put in that work early on, how long you can keep running with something with, minor tweaks to stay up with trends and all of that. And that's kind of the ultimate goal to some extent of a design system. So you don't have to do these massive redesigns every 5 years or so. You can just kind of keep iterating on it and tweaking things and adding and removing. And it becomes this more organic process when you do it right. And this is totally to a brand system as well. Although I do think it is a lot more fun to do a rebrand than a product redesign, to be totally honest.
I imagine that even though, the work there was well received, you probably still saw some comments on mean design Twitter.
Oh, yeah.
How
Well, I mean,
how did that
I
go?
had Eli Ship blocked logging. Yeah, I mean, so this was a learning experience, right? One thing I definitely know that I would do differently now is some of our colors in the palette, and a lot of that got fixed. But I think I would have, at that time, it was still a little bit in trend to go a little bit, still meeting accessibility guidelines, but a little bit light with text in terms of just, contrast and all of that. And I did lean into that a bit more than I would now. I would definitely go a little bit more bolder, functional. I would probably just increase contrast across the board. As far as I know, we did hit everything with accessibility. So it's not like, a huge fuck up or whatever, but just in terms of staying power, I think that was one of the first things that changed. And I was like, yeah, that should have been done while I was there. That one was kind of more just I ran out of time and mental energy to get to it, if I remember correctly.
Mhm.
But yeah, that was probably the one big thing I would change. It made sense and everyone did it, but we were using, this is such a silly thing, that we were using like 8 pixel border radius for most things. And I think that's such a boring border radius now. I totally would have changed that in hindsight.
What about just like emotionally and psychologically? Like, this is still relatively early in your career, and
Oh,
you
yeah.
are suddenly on this project that has, to an extent, like a very public stage. And then you go to Mean Design Twitter, which is sort of like a giant public one-way design crit where everyone just hurls their feedback at you. How did you deal with the criticism?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one thing that did help with Zendesk is most design did not use or really know about what we were doing at Zendesk, so it didn't actually get a lot of attention, which I'll be honest, I was kind of bummed about because I was like, oh, if people actually care about this, we'll get some really mean comments. And end of the day, I don't recall actually seeing anything particularly mean, other than I think people just didn't really get the relationships to start with. And we had this whole, and I think we all thought it was a wee bit silly internally also, that we had this whole like pitch deck explaining like, the philosophy behind the relationships. And it's just like, end of the day, it was like, oh, this is extensible and it looks pretty cool and it kind of has this Bauhaus vibe. Let's go with that. Not to say there wasn't a lot of thought and exploration put into it, but it's just like, we had that sort of foo-foo attitude toward it as well, which I thought was funny. I think more generally just dealing with criticism, because I definitely got a lot of criticism for other things I've worked on, like when I went back to Dropbox, definitely got criticism for Eventbrite and Square to an extent also, definitely a Meta. So, it's just something that you kind of learn to roll with. And I think for me, maybe the best piece of advice I can give people, and this is ironic saying this on a design broadcast, is don't make your whole identity about work or design. It's so freeing when you kind of just learn how to compartmentalize that aspect of your life. And that doesn't mean caring less about it or anything like that, but learning how to compartmentalize that and then just have a healthy personal life separated from, work and critique and all of that. And I think it's especially tricky with designers and especially tricky early in your career to build that because so much of, I mean, if you care about the craft and what you're doing, like you are putting a lot of yourself into whatever you're showing people, and that's fucking hard. Anyone that, does something on stage gets it. Doing critique, it's the same sort of thing. Like you're putting yourself out there and you're being vulnerable. And even in the like healthiest environments, that doesn't change that fundamental feeling that you have. So learning how to just compartmentalize that, and this goes back to the thing that I was talking about on the other side of, learning how to build trust with people and all of that. You can kind of push people along to get to that point of learning that it's not about them, it's about the work holistically. So just learning how to do that is really freeing mentally. And like therapy is great, but kind of going back to the point that I trailed off from of why this is challenging for designers also is just that like, I think so many of us are kind of afraid of doing something that people say is bad or something that would make us stupid. And then we wouldn't be seen as, smart or creative anymore. And there's kind of this whole sort of, I don't want to say ego, but there's kind of this whole thing. I guess it is to some extent in the classic terminology, like it is your ego around your design and your work. And that's not bad to have. It's just like learning how to not let that for you essentially when you get negative feedback or anything is just really important. And it's so hard to learn. Like I still take things personally and crit regularly. And I think you always will to some extent, but yeah, that's just learning how to separate those things is really important. And yeah, also therapy. Therapy is amazing. I highly recommend everyone who works in design and tech to, have a good therapist. Just good life advice for an adult in general.
Yeah, say more about that because certainly like for me it was truly late in my adult life and also in relationship to my career that I realized that therapy was something I should be doing and it was healthy. And, I mentioned earlier, a lot of people watching this are early in their career and therapy is probably not you listed all the different things and the skills that you learn and things you have to develop, things you have to catch up on to be successful in your career. Therapy is probably not on that list. How did is therapy something that you sort of grew up around as being normalized or was that something that you learned later?
It was a little bit normalized during it, but I think the big thing, I mean, it was never stigmatized while I was growing up. So I definitely, I got to a point where I've done this multiple times myself, where I've just started pushing way, way too hard at work. And a lot of the advice I'm giving, I'm not necessarily good at following it. I am a workaholic in a lot of cases. I get obsessive about things and I just can take things way too personally sometimes. And I think my point with all of that is there's whether or not you preemptively start, just taking better care of yourself through therapy and through just working on mental health and all of that, you're probably going to hit a point in your career, particularly working in tech or anywhere that's like very high pressure, high stress, and where you have this sense of needing to prove yourself and while also being kind of scared of not presenting yourself correctly to a group and just building a name for yourself, all these things that you kind of are feeling earlier on in your career. Working with a good therapist or just having someone that you can talk to, relate to, having a mentor that you can talk to outside of your job, however fashion that takes, that's just so good for being able to get to that point where you can compartmentalize things. And, I think this is something that a lot of designers, in this, vague millennial phase of 30s to 40s right now are feeling is that a lot of us did kind of bone really hard through our 20s and are paying the consequences for it now. I think even some of the other episodes on this podcast, people have talked about, mental health and all that sort of stuff. And it's something that you will find out is very important later on in life, whether or not you see it earlier on, in your 20s or whatever, but you can kind of preempt this. So that's why I suggest just find someone that you can talk to, whether that's a therapist, a friend, parents, whatever form that takes that works for you. Just don't keep stuff bottled up and just build that self-awareness of when you need to take a break or change things or whatever. And having someone to bounce things off of is so helpful for that.
Did you, when you first started to going to more formal therapy and in relationship to the work that you were doing, did that start out of sort of in reaction to a situation that had built up with you in your work life? Or was it more preemptive, you were sort of aware enough that it was preventative, I guess?
Yeah, so I would say it's kind of a combination of those two things. So right after Zendesk, I jumped like pretty immediately over to Dropbox and is working on, to some extent the rebrand there, but not nearly in the same like capacity that I was at Zendesk. It was really, really high pressure. And I kind of just got to a point where I was like, oh, if I don't do something different, I'm just going to snap because I feel like I'm about to completely lose my mind. And that's kind of what I learned what burnout really, really feels like. So that was kind of a pivotal point for me where I was just like, I am not happy with how my life is going right now, how I'm feeling, how things are balanced. I just need to make changes. And I thankfully, was working with a really great therapist then. And I was just like, I'm not sure what's going on in my life, but I just want to do something different. So whatever you tell me, I'm just like open to doing something different. So that kind of gets back to it was a little preemptive because it's before anything like happened or I had like completely burnt out, but it was a point where I did preemptively recognize, oh, I'm very much getting to this point. And I think like the sooner that you learn to just kind of recognize when you need a change, when you need a break is really important there. Really, really will just set you up for being able to have a more just stable path of things rather than like ups and downs. And I think figuring out balance is really, really helpful for living a life where you're not just stressed all the time and having panic attacks.
I think, especially in this industry, because things are moving at such a fast pace, things are constantly changing, and you do have companies like Dropbox where you get into this hyper growth phase. Burnout sort of is a real part of like something that a lot of people deal with, but a lot of it is like the frog in the boiling pot of water. Like it can be hard to recognize it until it's too late. And so for you, since you'd gone through that, what advice would you have for someone else on maybe like what the early warning signs are that you might look out for that should give you an indication that you might need to pay attention to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think really I would say stress levels. Like if you're getting home from work, I guess when people went into offices, although I guess that's changing now. Anyway, when you get off work and if you can't really detach yourself from it and you're just feeling stressed, and everyone feels stress a little bit differently. For me, I just like end up feeling sick to my stomach, so it's noticeable pretty quick. But if you're just constantly feeling like you're in stress, that's a really good early indicator that you probably need a break, need to slow down. And I think, what are some other early signs? I mean, really so much of it is just like not being able to detach from work. That's like, I think the biggest thing. So yeah, just kind of like self-assess yourself every once in a while of like, am I able to have a healthy day where I don't think about work and don't feel any stress? If the answer is no, then you probably should like be thinking about, I don't know, just slowing down a little bit, just figuring out a better balance.
You back to Dropbox because, I mean, you were there through a very exciting time, but also a very stressful time. And when you went back, it was still hypergrowth, right?
Still hypergrowth-ish and still very, very stressful. But I mean, so much, when I say a place is stressful, so much of it is about me at the time also and me making it stressful with my neuroses and all of that. But yeah, I mean, when I went back, I mean, Dropbox has pretty much always had a brilliant design theme. And, I'll be honest, there was a little bit of ego involved with it where I was like, okay, am I good enough to do design at Dropbox? And being able to kind of prove that. And for me, it wasn't about proving that to anyone else. It was about proving that to myself that I could like work at that level with like on a team with so many people I admire and followed for a long time. So that was, and I'll admit it, it was definitely like an ego-stroking moment to be able to go and do that. Nowadays, I like don't think about it at all, like in terms of the prestige of where you work. And I think that was really naive and silly of me at the time. I think it's more important to be working on something that you actually find interesting. Not saying I didn't find stuff I worked on. It's just saying that came out wrong. I love everywhere that I worked.
I mean, so you didn't have formal training or formal background in design. Your first role in tech was not a design role. And, you're sort of telling the story about how you moved into design at Zendesk, and it was because a project that you did out of necessity, not one that you were necessarily like specifically hired for. You did, and people liked it. So you kind of like almost fell into like an official design role. At what, and then, you were talking about going to Dropbox as a sort of proof to yourself that you're at that caliber of designer. At what point did you feel like, or like acknowledge to yourself, I'm a designer, versus like still trying to break your way in?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, end of the day, like I still feel like such an imposter. All of you Gen Z kids, you are way too good at this, and I feel very intimidated by the amazing talent out there right now. Like I don't. It's funny. Like I don't think I've ever got over that imposter syndrome sort of thing. I think a lot of designers have that same feeling. I still feel like I need to prove myself. I still feel like there's so much I need to learn. I don't know if I ever really have felt like, oh, I'm a designer. But it's also one of the things where I intentionally have not made that part of like my identity or even like my shtick online. And I think that's been one of the better decisions that I've made because I can kind of, I don't know, I think it's very easy to build your identity around one thing, and building it around work is often not the smartest thing to do. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think I've ever really quite hit that point where I feel like I've proven myself to myself. I know I don't really need to prove anything to anyone else at this point, and I think, but I still kind of feel like I do. It's a really weird, vague thing, and this is something I talk with my therapist a lot about. But yeah, I think probably a lot of people have that feeling of just like, I don't feel like I am XYZ identity or whatever, and it's just kind of this, yeah, imposter syndrome. It never really goes away.
I'd love to unpack that a little bit because, I mean,
Yeah.
for a lot of people, they, and it's like you said, at some point, the where you work and the prestige, it's not about that. But at some point, like there are people at really amazing, talented design teams who've sort of like agreed that you are like a great designer. You've worked as a designer at Dropbox, at Pinterest, at Meta. Like these are all well-known high caliber design teams. And so, and yet you still feel imposter syndrome. Like, so that's clearly
Yeah.
not it. What else do you think it
I
is?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're gonna get like deep, deep into it. I think it's going to sound like a tangent, but I think this is actually something that probably a lot of listeners might relate to. So if you don't follow me on Twitter or any of the other places that I'm online, you may not know that I am extremely openly gay, and know that since I was like, I don't know, as early as I can remember. I always kind of. I also grew up very evangelical Christian and went to Christian schools, all of that. And end of the day, a lot of my growing up in childhood was not feeling like accepted or belonged in places. And I think, a lot of people getting into design, getting into being on your own and an adult for maybe the first time, building a career, all of these things have aspects of where you can feel like you don't belong. And I think if you have, other formative, experiences like, maybe being a minority or, I'm not phrasing this very well. You know what I mean? Just like if you've struggled with like your identity in other ways, you can kind of bring that into work and like your perception of yourself as a designer. That was a better way to phrase it. Cut out the previous bit. But yeah, I think I've always kind of had this looming sense that I don't belong or like something, I'm going to be ostracized for some reason or whatever. There's always been that looming fear, and it's not logical or whatever. I mean, that's what fears essentially are. They're non-logical reactions to stimuli in a lot of cases. And that's definitely one. And I think it's a general thing that I'm working on in therapy. And this is also why therapy is amazing, because you can start to figure out these connections that you wouldn't otherwise get on your own. And yeah, just like figuring out how to be more trusting and, be more at peace with what's going on in my life and all that is something that I'm still working on. And, I think it's going to be still a while before I get to that point where I really feel like I've earned what I've done and earned, the roles and the stuff I've worked on. So yeah, that's maybe not the most inspirational thing to say, but it is, it's a journey and it's work.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think quite the opposite. I think there are, like you said, many other people out there who, for one reason or another, have like this level of imposter syndrome that they can't shake, some part of their identity that they struggle with. whether it's professional or personal or whatever. And there aren't always a lot of people that you can turn to sort of hear
Yeah.
like what they're going through or how they overcame it. And even for yourself, even though you may still feel like you're working on it, I think that gives you a very like unique and great perspective to help others who are going through it too. I imagine as, in your roles as a people manager, you've probably had people around you or on your team who have struggled with the same thing, because I think imposter syndrome is very common
Yes.
in our industry. What
Totally.
advice do you have for someone to help them work through it, overcome it, process it, like whatever their next step is?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So I'll preface this by saying, obviously, all of this depends on, the person and, everyone has different communication styles, all that, blah, 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 blah. There, there's no one size fits all solution for this. But I'd say it goes back to something I was talking about earlier, which is authentic leadership. And, if you lead by also showing, vulnerability on your side to some extent and, show that you're human as well. And like, you have bad days, have good days, and just within reason are just open and honest in that way with people that you're working with, which I think is actually very easy in tech because so often you are so closely working with people, it inevitably happens anyway. And obviously there's some complications with that as a people manager. So, there's a longer discussion about that. But yeah, just like showing that, you go through those same sorts of things and like are relatable in that way. It's a way to like, again, build trust also. So then you can actually have those, more in-depth conversations about these things. Because not everyone is going to off the bat or even ever be like willing to open up in that way. And that's fine because that's not a requirement of the job. But showing that like he can be someone that you can talk to if you're feeling stressed or imposter syndrome. And then when I do have those conversations with people, so often my advice, particularly if I'm on the same team, managing what have you, I always suggest like find someone outside of the company that you can talk to about things also, because there's things that you're never going to feel comfortable talking with your manager or even someone else at the same company. I certainly had that, and that's why I have friends outside the company to talk to. But that's one of the best pieces of advice I can give. And I do frequently, it's like find someone outside of where you're currently working and have them as like a sounding board and return the favor to them as well. That's usually one of my first pieces of advice after just trying to be there for people. And if they want me to be a sounding board for something, I am always happy to do that.
I mean, even though what you're recommending is to find someone outside of work, what you described as, a manager and a leader in the organization is to be both authentic, but also very vulnerable at work as an example for other people. I think that takes a tremendous amount of courage.
Oh, yeah.
Where did you find that courage to be able to do that? Because also as a manager, you sort of get this impression that you're supposed to have all the ideas and got to be rock solid and
Yeah.
no holes. And this
Yeah.
is like, very much sometimes the opposite. How did you get to a point where you felt comfortable doing that?
Yeah. I mean, I think Eventbrite was where I really, really started to feel that. And that was like definitely a trial by fire sort of situation as well. So I was kind of learning as I went. But, that kind of touches on like change management is such an important skill to learn, both as an IC or if you get into management. And that was something I got like a crash course on Eventbrite because we had like reorg after reorg and crisis after crisis that we were working through. And, kind of out of necessity that led me to being very just authentic with the team because I didn't necessarily know what was going on at a given point. And sometimes there was stuff I was privy to and my team would be asking me about it. And I had to be like pretty firm that I was just like, look, yes, I do know what's going on, but no, I can't tell you. And your XYZ reasons what. And I wasn't sure that was going to actually resonate with anyone. And to be honest, at the moment when I said that, I was just like kind of annoyed by being asked the same question over and over again. But I think people actually really appreciated that I was just straightforward about like what was actually happening and not just kind of bullshitting around and being like, let's talk about something else or just kind of like trying to hand wave it away. I was like, yeah, I know what's going on, which I think is important to establish as a leader when you're going through like big changes, because if your manager says like, I don't know what the fuck is going on while big changes are happening, that is going to freak you out. So I actually think it's really important to kind of be firm in these situations of like, I know what's going on, don't worry, but I can't talk about it. And sometimes you just have to like be pretty firm around that. And that was, again, something that I learned at Eventbrite while I was going through all of this. And that kind of led to just across the board us building really good relationships as a team. And then, being able to have these, I would say, authentic friendships that spun out of that. So I kind of learned a lot of this like on the fly at Eventbrite.
One sort of like metaphor that I think is common in the industry is the idea of like peacetime and wartime CEOs. You get peacetime and wartime companies. And so what you described was sort of like learning these things and building these relationships with your team. Like you said, through
like
the
fire.
World
War I trenches. Yeah.
Have you found ways to kind of replicate those types of outcomes in more of a peacetime environment?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that you often do have more of in peacetime is a little bit more time and a little bit less urgency. So I think what I like to do in those situations is spend a lot more one-on-one time with people. And again, this goes back to the jam session concept of just like sitting down on working on things together. Because you do in peacetime have a bit more time to be exploratory, try different things. And like during these sessions, I always really try and encourage people to like try at least one or two iterations of something that's what you would really like to like fuck feasibility or whatever. Like just try and design something that's like, if you could build this however you wanted, what would it be? And that often starts to also just, first of all, it's just fun to do that together. And that helps build this sort of trust and relationship in a different way, rather than like the trial by fire. But it also allows people a space to be a bit vulnerable by expressing ideas that they maybe otherwise didn't have courage to show, and just making it a safe place to do that. And that kind of builds, I hope it builds people up to where they feel more comfortable just trying novel things and sharing. So I think this maybe gets into a pet peeve that's nobody's fault in the industry right now, of just like maybe playing things a little bit too safe or just making the same thing over and over and over again. And I think, with the rise of AI as any sort of product area, there's probably hopefully a lot of opportunities just like get a little bit weird with stuff and try new things rather than just being like, oh, we're building a marketplace. Here's what Amazon does. Let's just do that, because they've clearly tested this more than we have. And I've been totally guilty of stealing stuff from other companies. Everyone does it. But yeah, I think just giving the space to actually try new things is helpful for maybe pushing people to think outside of just like what we know is good solutions already. Good can always be better.
Very cool. Matt, this has been an incredible conversation. I want to thank you for being so willing to share openly, and also just kind of seeing your journey, not just your accomplishments in your career, but kind of what you've learned and how you've evolved as a designer. Some of your stories about like at Eventbrite and working through uncertainty, I think are really important for a lot of people right now. Certainly the industry and just the market, for new designers who are looking for their next role, the market right now can be really tough and sort of uncertain. What advice do you have for a designer who's kind of at the beginning of their journey and is facing so much uncertainty happening right now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the reality of it is in this industry, I think we all know that it's to say it's difficult to break into design early career is an understatement. I mean, that's why so many people essentially just like chain internships back to back to back and all that, which is totally valid, not knocking that, but it's kind of a symptom of just, it is really, really hard to break in. I mean, I can think on one hand right now, the number of companies I've seen have open recs for like new grads and all that. It's not the same as in engineering where it's like, oh, well, I can go to Amazon for 2 years or Microsoft and, I'll get my cert in my career, no problem. And I think this is something that as like more senior folks in leadership and design, we all need to do better on and advocate when we're doing, headcount and budget and all of that to push more for junior roles and opportunity to bring people in, because it's good across the board for team health to be having a steady stream of junior folks coming in, because first of all, you can get more amazing talent in the door and help build up people's careers and all that, and provide great opportunities for like mentorship and leadership for your more like mid-level and senior folks, which is really important for their next step in their careers as well. So there's no downside to it. You just have to be willing to like put 10% of your team effort into actually mentoring and coaching and really, getting people up to speed. And so we need to just do better as a leadership in the industry. And I know it's a very complicated issue, but this is my roundabout way of saying, like, it just kind of sucks breaking into design, to be totally honest. But I think really good things you can do. So Dan Petty has great, just like, I think, suggestions for getting new design roles. So many people on Twitter have better advice than I do. So recommend checking folks like that out for sure. But just making sure that you're continuing to design, sharing stuff on, Twitter or Behance or Dribbble or wherever you're at is really good, even if it's just conceptual stuff. I know people not like sharing conceptual stuff or unsolicited redesigns on Dribbble a while ago. I think it's still helpful for just seeing where people are trying new things, playing around with things, where your taste lies. So I think it's still really, really valuable. And then also just like, now that you can actually go out and do stuff, go to design meetups, stuff like that. In-person connection and like meeting or even online connection and just like building relationships is so important because like most of the jobs have been through DMs on Twitter. So like building those relationships out are really important. And I think are good jumping points to landing your first like full-time design gig. But I'm not going to like bullshit and say it's super easy right now. I mean, regardless of your level, like the market is just rough right now. That looks like Q4 and early next year turning around. I know everyone's doing budgeting right now, so I've got to hear a lot about that.
Matt, where can people find you online if they want to follow you more, see more of your work?
Yeah, so Twitter is probably the best place. I am at SFTJack, which I think will be linked in the description below. I'm also on LinkedIn. I've increasingly not been super online, but Twitter, I still post a healthy stream of, and I'm going to keep calling it Twitter. I know it's X. I'm never going to remember that. It's Twitter. It's always going to be Twitter. But yeah, I just post cat memes basically. So you can find me there. I will have stuff up on Twitch and YouTube soon, but those channels aren't public yet. So follow me on Twitter.
Awesome. Thanks again, Matt. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was an absolute blast.
And that wraps up our conversation with Matt Armstrong. What a story. From breaking into design without formal training to navigating imposter syndrome and burnout, Matt's story is a reminder that personal growth is just as important as career growth. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on the next one. We'll explore another fascinating career in the world of UX design. Thanks for watching. I'm Chris Abad, and we'll see you next time on Pixelated Path.